Hello, Miss Gilmore's second graders. This is Mrs. Frank, and I'm back reading a little bit more of Appleseed Farm. Right now we are in chapter 4, and it's called Indians! Exclamation point behind it. Once again, Ada stacked the dishes and took them to the bench outside to wash. She noted that the sky had clouded over and that a wind had sprung up. She scowled. It had rained almost every day for 2 weeks, and she hated to be cooped up in the house. Besides, she had meant to hurry through her work and join the men in the field. She wanted to hear Johnny Appleseed talk and be with him as he worked with her father. Well, perhaps she could beat the rain. Who cared if the cups were not dry? They would be by night, and the kettles might just as well soak. Ada carried a load of clean bowls and spoons back to the house and put them away. Then she started out for more. Halfway across the cabin floor, she stopped in her tracks like an animal frozen by fear. For the second time that day, she was face to face with a stranger, and this one was an Indian. His bare legs, red skin, and black hair left no doubt about that. He stood in the doorway, peering at her. In his cold black eyes, there was no look of friendship. And the caption at the bottom says, Ada was too scared to scream. I think you heard from previous chapters what their thoughts about the Indians were, and so I'm certain she's very scared. Ada was too scared to scream. She could not move. She could only stare at him. You all alone? The Indian asked softly. White man, go away. With her eyes fixed on the Indian, Ada suddenly recalled her father's warnings. Never show fear. Pretend to be friends. She took a deep breath, forced a sickly smile, and said in a wobbly voice, Hello, please come in and sit down. Maybe I can find you something to eat. The Indian stared at her, peered farther into the room, and finally nodded. Then he glided over to the table and sat down. Ada did not wait. She had control over her legs again, and as quick as one of the red man's arrows, she shot behind him out of the house and toward the field. Indians! She screamed, Indians! She ran with all her might, but in her panic, she tripped over a root a few yards from the house and thudded to the ground. Her breath was knocked out of her, and she lay there helpless, right within reach of the Indian. She was too winded even to call again. All she could do was wait for the end. Maybe he would scalp her right there. Maybe he would carry her off to his camp. She wondered if her family would ever find out what happened to her. She wondered if her father had even heard her scream. In the space of a second, she wondered a great many things. Then it occurred to her to wonder why she was still lying there unhurt. She lifted her head. Along the path charged her father, rifle in hand, her fine, brave father who would protect her always. But suddenly the picture changed. A man dashed up and knocked her father's rifle to the ground. It was Johnny Appleseed. I'll take care of this, he cried. Then, raising his voice, he shouted to the Indian, Friends, we're friends. Ada sat up, facing the cabin. She saw an ugly sight. The Indian filled the doorway, and in his hands he held Tom Bartlett's second rifle. Her father was unarmed because of Johnny Appleseed, and the savage covered him with his own rifle. For a moment, Ada hated Johnny Appleseed. He was running toward the cabin, shouting strange words at the Indian. The red man grunted. Johnny Appleseed spoke again. Then slowly the Indian lowered his rifle. Johnny Appleseed, talking and gesturing, was almost at the cabin now. When he reached the door, the Indian laid down the rifle and greeted him as a friend. Tom Bartlett hurried up with a scowl on his face. He came on purpose hunting me, Johnny Appleseed explained, beaming with relief. I was with his people last week. He's come to take me back to settle a quarrel with the traitor. Then he talked to the red man in the Indian tongue. He pointed to Tom Bartlett and then out to the field, as though explaining that he must help the settler finish some work. While he stood there, the sky grew darker and the rain began to fall. Ada conquered her panic enough to come back to the cabin. She sidled up to her father and clung to his hand as they all went out of the rain. Johnny Appleseed saw how uneasy Ada and her father were with the red man. He also saw how sullenly the red man looked at the little girl who had run for help and at her father who had come charging at him with a rifle. "How would you like to give Hawkeye a drink of water, Ada?" Johnny Appleseed asked, "and maybe some of your good cornbread." Ada hurried to place food before the Indian. That is how it happened that Mrs. Bartlett, when she came home a little later, found an Indian sitting at her table devouring her cornbread. She could not hide her amazement. However, when Johnny Appleseed asked her to invite Hawkeye to stay until the weather cleared, she bravely obeyed. Hawkeye looked up and gravely shook his head. Rain would not hurt his clothes, and he wanted to hurry home with the message of the great white medicine man, as he called Johnny Appleseed. Before the Indian left, Johnny Appleseed took a hand of each of the men in his. "You are friends now," he said to them. "Hawkeye has eaten Tom Bartlett's bread. Hawkeye and Tom Bartlett are both friends of Johnny Appleseed. They must be friends of each other." Tom Bartlett gave his hand to the Indian. They eyed each other sternly, but they promised to be friends. Then Hawkeye stalked down the path and out of sight. The only person who was not happy the way things had turned out was Ned. He came sloshing home through the rain and could hardly forgive Ada for having been the one to see an Indian. "If I'd been home, I wouldn't have gone bawling for help," he bragged. "I'd just have made one move for that rifle over the mantel and poked it into his ribs before I said, 'How'd you do?' Yes, and likely your scalp would have been dangled from his belt before you made another move," his father said. "That pledge we made gives me some peace of mind, Johnny Appleseed," he went on. "Maybe Hawkeye is a good Indian, as you say, but I'm thankful you were with us when he called. I wouldn't like to bet on how good he would have been if the great white medicine man hadn't been here." And there is a picture of Hawkeye. And that ends Chapter 4 of Section 2. Take care.